There was a time when the forest was simply a place on the map, shaped like any other green blur, bordered by lines drawn long ago by hands that no longer remembered why they bothered. It was never vast enough to be feared, nor tame enough to be inviting. It existed the way an overlooked room does in a house too large for its occupants. Quiet, unimposing, collecting time like dust. The village nearby never spoke ill of it, nor did they praise it. Children played at its edge but never asked to enter. Hunters traced its borders but found game elsewhere. Even the wind, when it passed over the hills, seemed to slow as it approached the trees, like breath held between words. It began, as many things do, not with a sound, but with the absence of one. A dog, old and loyal, known by everyone for its bark at the hour the baker's fire was lit, simply stopped. The silence was not noticed until it lasted too long. Then came the girl, who no longer cast a shadow one morning as she fetched water. She laughed, held out her arms in the light, spun like it was a trick. But her grandmother wept. That evening, the sky turned the color of pewter, and the trees on the horizon seemed closer than they had ever been. No one said anything aloud, but shutters were drawn earlier than usual, and candles burned longer into the night. Those who ventured near the forest spoke of the air, how it felt stretched as though time had been pulled thinner between the branches. The ground, soft and undisturbed, held no footprints past a certain point. Birds flew above, but none nested within. Shadows, once faithful, began to behave oddly. They narrowed when they should have spread. They flickered under clear skies. A woman, tending her garden near the woods, watched her husband's silhouette detach for a moment as he walked, pause, then rejoin him. She never mentioned it. Instead, she planted lavender by the window and closed the curtains, even when it was bright. Some said it was a trick of light, a fault in the sun's position, or a strange tilt of the earth beneath that patch of land. Others whispered that it was not the shadows themselves that had changed, but those who cast them. Something within perhaps had grown dim, but the truth did not care for theories. The forest remained. It did not pull, did not beckon, did not warn. It simply existed, and one by one those who felt unseen began to walk toward it, not in fear, but in curiosity. For what is a shadow, after all, but the visible tether to a self we may no longer wish to carry? They came without plan, no maps, no farewells, just a sense that something unnameable was missing, and perhaps the trees might answer it. Some walked with purpose, shoes worn by long roads in silence. Others drifted in like smoke, slow, shapeless, indistinct. One by one they stepped into the perimeter, where the grass grew sparse, and the light filtered like memory through lace. It did not feel like entering, more like dissolving into a place that had long prepared for them. There were no signs of recent life, no moss disturbed, no branches broken. The forest received them the way forgotten things welcome company, with stillness, not embrace. The trees did not speak, but they seemed to know. Each one, tall yet unremarkable, held a posture of observation, as if leaning slightly in. Their trunks were smooth in parts, scarred in others, ridges like veins beneath bark. From a distance, the canopy resembled an old ceiling painting, cracked and fading, holding the last hues of a century once rich with color. Those beneath it felt no threat, only a strange lightness, as if gravity remembered them less the farther they walked. A scarf fell from a shoulder but did not land. It hovered briefly, then vanished into undergrowth that did not rustle. The woman who lost it did not turn back. Some tried to keep count of their steps. Others attempted to leave markings, but the forest forgot them quickly. Stones stacked became unstacked. Lines drawn in the dirt smoothed themselves out, as if the ground did not wish to keep record. Names whispered were swallowed into the leaves. Time behaved differently, too. A man entered at dawn and believed it was still morning when he stopped to rest. Yet when he looked up, the sun was low, and shadows, if they still existed, were beginning to stretch where they could. He tried to check his watch, only to find it unmoving, hands frozen in indecision. The deeper they walked, the more their bodies softened. Not physically, not in form, but in insistence. Movements slowed, not from fatigue, but from fading need. Hunger passed like a forgotten dream. Pain dimmed into a distant recollection. They touched bark and could no longer feel its roughness. They breathed and wondered if air still held shape. And all the while their shadows, once loyal and automatic, began to hesitate. A man paused beside a shallow pool and saw nothing beneath him. Only water, reflecting sky. He reached down, expecting distortion, but the surface remained unbroken, as if he no longer interrupted the world around him. There were no paths, yet their feet found the same places. A bend where no wind blew, a clearing where light arrived but did not leave, a tree with bark dark as sleep, around which no insects crawled. They did not speak, not out of vow, but because sound felt unnecessary. Thoughts flowed like air, light, slow, continuous. Each step deeper into the forest became less a choice and more a surrender, not to the forest itself, but to the quiet shape of forgetting. And in that surrender, the absence of shadow felt less like loss and more like a long overdue mercy. There was a particular silence that only the forest understood, not the silence of absence but of absorption. Every footstep vanished into the soil without echo. Leaves shifted without sound. Even memories brought in by those who entered seemed to fall quiet, like children who understood they had wandered into a room where something sacred was asleep. Thoughts became less sharp. Names began to fade from inside the mind, not with panic, but with peace. Someone once tried to remember the face of their mother. It floated near the surface, then sank like a coin dropped into still water. It did not disturb the depth. Strange things grew where light did not reach. Thin white roots, like threads, curled from the base of trees and climbed upward as if seeking something forgotten. In one hollow, a fern pulsed slowly, like breath. The color of it shifted with the angle of one's gaze, not green, not silver, but something in between, as if language had not yet decided what it should be called. Beneath this plant, a child once sat for hours, unmoving, her back straight, her eyes wide open. When she rose, her hands bore the print of bark, and her feet made no sound at all. She walked further in, smiling at nothing. Those who remained outside the forest felt a distance that could not be crossed, even if only a few steps away. The edge of the trees blurred at certain hours, and voices calling into the dark never carried. Lanterns held at the perimeter seemed weaker, the flames smaller, as though the air itself disapproved of brightness. Some left offerings, food, letters, worn shoes, but nothing was ever taken, except once, when a photograph vanished overnight. A woman had placed it at the roots of an old oak. The next morning it was gone, and the earth beneath it was warm to the touch. She never returned. The forest did not consume, it did not trap, it simply forgot with you, as if it had been waiting for someone to understand that forgetting is not erasure, but transformation. A slow loosening, a gentle erosion of edges. Inside, people did not lose themselves. They shed themselves, like coats no longer needed in a place where weather did not touch. One man walked for hours before noticing he no longer wore shoes, though he had never stopped to remove them. Another reached up to brush hair from his forehead, only to realize he had shaved it years ago. The forest returned them not to their beginnings, but to something earlier, before definition. At night, if night could be said to exist there, the dark took on a softness, not a blackness, but a velvet gray that wrapped itself around limbs and thought alike. The trees did not shift, but their outlines blurred slightly, as if sighing. There was no sleep, because there was no fatigue. Instead, there was drift. Those who stayed found themselves becoming less solid, not in body but in presence, like ink diluted in water, still visible but spreading wider, softer, farther from where it started. No one marked where they sat. No one asked where they would go next. Along a narrow ravine within the forest, there stood a stone that bore no carvings. It was not large, nor particularly shaped, yet everyone who reached it paused, not because it commanded them, but because it reminded them of something. Not a memory, but a sensation. Like a smell you almost recognize, or the edge of a song you once heard in a dream. They stood before it, not out of reverence, but familiarity, the way one touches the frame of a childhood door without knowing why. And then they moved on, lighter, though they could not explain what had lifted. Near this stone, the shadows grew faintest, not absent, but faded into suggestion. A hand extended into the sunlight left only a whisper on the ground. Faces reflected in the nearby pool were there one moment, gone the next. A young man crouched to study the surface, but what he saw was not his own face. It was the empty curve of sky. He waited for something to form. Nothing did. He dipped his fingers in, expecting a ripple. The water did not respond. He felt moisture, but saw no disturbance. He smiled, not in amusement, but in understanding. In the forest, the passage of time did not anchor itself. Moss grew sideways. Leaves stayed green long after their season. A tree might bloom in one branch while the others held frost. Time did not misbehave. It simply opted out. It no longer served as a sequence, but a presence. Around some trunks, vines held the same position year after year, unmoved by wind or age. In other places, mushrooms formed perfect circles that glowed faintly in dusk and disappeared by morning, never returning to the same place twice. Each sign, though gentle, whispered that this was not land governed by clocks. Some who entered began to forget the language of before. Not completely. They still knew hunger, the word if not the sensation. They remembered home, though the shape of it slipped, but names became harder, even their own. A woman once stood still for an entire day, repeating a single name until it no longer sounded like anything. Then she exhaled, knelt in the grass, and let her hair trail behind her like a thread she no longer needed to pull. She stayed that way, unmoving, until the wind stopped noticing her. Animals were rare, no deer grazed, no birds nested, but sometimes something passed just beyond sight, a suggestion of motion, a shiver of leaves with no breeze, a glint of eyes that held no malice, only patience. The forest was not empty, it was observing, waiting, not for visitors but for decisions. When a person sat long enough, their outline softened, their breathing slowed, their skin, warmed by a sun no longer tracked, began to take on the tones of the bark nearby. And then, without effort, they were simply part of the place. Not gone, not transformed, just included. There was a rhythm beneath the forest, but it was not one of sound. It was a pulse, not felt in the body, but in the spaces between thoughts. Those who sat with stillness long enough began to sense it, not as a beat, but as an unfolding, like the way mist rises over water, slow and without origin. It asked nothing. It did not intrude, but it noticed. And once it noticed you, you began to change, not in skin or flesh, but in narrative. You no longer described yourself by who you had been, but by how little of that still mattered. Identity loosened like a shoelace untied during a long walk. Children adapted fastest, not because they understood more, but because they resisted less. One child drew circles in the soil with her finger. No one taught her this. She simply traced loops that never crossed. When the rain came, and it always did, though no one remembered when, it washed the patterns away without altering the ground. The child blinked, looked at her clean hand, then began again. The second set of circles was smaller, quieter. She did not look at the sky, but it dimmed as she worked. The forest did not grow denser the farther one went. Instead, it grew clearer. The spaces between trees widened. The roots curled more neatly. The undergrowth thinned as if the earth had swept it aside for you. But this clarity was not openness. It was intimacy. You began to see details you hadn't before. The tilt of a branch that mirrored the arch of your shoulder. A knot in bark shaped like a wound you once had. A leaf that curled the way your fingers did when you slept. The forest was not reflecting you. It was remembering you differently. In that remembering, shadows no longer returned. Once lost, they did not reform. Light passed through you without resistance. You stood in sunlight, but left nothing behind. Not absence, not shape, only presence. Some felt fear at first, reaching down to where their shadow should fall. But that fear passed quickly, replaced by something like awe. The realization that nothing tethered them anymore. They were no longer anchored to proof. They could move without echo. They could exist without aftermath. It felt like forgiveness. Occasionally, someone would try to leave. They would walk back toward where they thought the edge had been. But the forest did not punish. It simply did not cooperate. Trees that had parted would realign. Stones would reappear. The path would drift sideways. Eventually, most gave up, not out of defeat, but relief, because they understood that what waited outside required definition again. Names, shadows, clocks. And here, in the forest, all of that had quietly lifted. Not stolen, just no longer required, so they stayed. Not out of enchantment, not from trap, but because staying felt like the first honest thing they had done in a long, long time. There was no center to the forest, no heart or clearing that declared itself final. The deeper one went, the more the forest simply became. It did not end, it thinned into the shape of understanding. Here, the ground was soft and clean, not dirt, not moss, something between. Walking became floating, resting became existing. The body's needs unraveled. Hunger ceased. Memory receded like a tide no longer pulled by a moon you could not see. And among those who stayed, something new emerged. Not spoken, not agreed upon, but shared. A kind of collective silence that felt like prayer without words. At times, someone would pause and look skyward, though no sky could be seen. Their eyes widened, not from wonder, but recognition, as if they saw not upward, but inward. Their face would soften, their shoulders ease. Some lay down beside the roots and closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to merge. No one watched. No one marked the spot. Yet the forest did not forget. In the days that followed, a new vine might bloom nearby. A tree might lean slightly in the direction they had lain. A soundless ripple passed through the place, not like wind, but like a held breath released. They did not become trees. They did not vanish. They became less singular, less apart. Their edges blurred until their being became an atmosphere. Those who walked nearby would feel it, a hush deeper than quiet, a warmth that came not from the sun, but from presence, a feeling of being seen not for what you carried, but for what you no longer needed to hold. It was not immortality. It was not death. It was arrival. Finally, arrival. And still, the forest waited. There was a place where even memory found it difficult to stay. It lay just beyond the reach of ordinary forest paths, past where the air grew heavier, not with humidity, but with history. The ones who arrived there did not walk quickly. They moved with the reverence of those approaching something sacred, even if they didn't know why. Around them, the trees grew farther apart, not in neglect, but in invitation. The earth was smoother here, less wild. It felt prepared, as if something or someone had been expecting them for a long time, and had made a bed of quiet just for their arrival. They had forgotten what they had been holding on to. Regrets began to fall from their shoulders like water slipping from cloth. Faces from the past blurred not because they were unwanted, but because the burden of remembering every detail suddenly seemed unnecessary. The voice of a father softened into mere rhythm. The name of a lost child dissolved into feeling. Some bent down and touched the ground, not to test its firmness, but to connect with it, like pressing a palm against the chest of a sleeping friend. The soil was neither cold nor warm. It simply was. Present, receptive, unjudging. Above them, the light came not from any discernible sun, but from a diffuse radiance that settled between branches like breath. It cast no hard lines. Nothing had a shadow anymore. Not fully. When someone moved, the forest did not respond with light play. It merely absorbed the presence, acknowledging movement the way water accepts a fish's passing. In this place, nothing chased, not even light. There was no sense of being watched, only of being witnessed, a presence so ancient and impartial it no longer needed eyes. One man knelt in a shallow groove in the earth, where no plant grew and no insect crawled. He did not know why he knelt, only that it felt right. He placed his hands in front of him, not in prayer, but in offering, not of himself, but of his silence. And the forest accepted it. Around him, leaves continued their stillness. A single petal drifted down from somewhere and landed on his shoulder without a sound. He did not flinch. The moment passed, and he was part of it. When he rose, he left no imprint behind. The ground rose gently to meet its own level again. Those who entered this part of the forest did not come for transformation. They came for stillness, for the pause between who they had been and what they would no longer need to be. Here, titles held no shape. A teacher, a thief, a mother, a ghost, all stood equal in the hush. Their lives did not disappear. They simply no longer mattered in the same way. The forest offered no mirrors, not to reflect what had changed, but to release the need to look. In its space, one did not measure oneself against the world. One merely dissolved into the space where measuring had ceased. At the outer edges of this grove, if one could call it that, there stood a tree unlike the others. It was smooth as bone and pale as early fog. Its roots coiled not down, but across the surface of the ground, mapping veins like an open palm. No one dared touch it. Not out of fear, but respect. It was not sacred. It was simply complete. A reminder that some things do not grow because they no longer need to. They have arrived, and now they wait, not for others, but for stillness to recognize itself again. Not everyone who entered this part of the forest stayed. Some reached a point where they could go no further, not because something blocked them, but because something within refused to proceed. It was as if a quiet agreement had been reached between the self and the space around it. A recognition. Some turned around. Others stood still, unmoving for days, watching the forest drift gently past them, like fog reshaping around a still stone. In that stillness, they waited for a reason, not to go forward or back, but simply to be allowed to remain without question. A woman once traced her own footprints backward with her eyes, only to find they had already faded. There was no path she had made, no impression of her journey. It was not frightening. If anything, it felt like kindness. The forest had taken her presence and folded it neatly into its memory, without keeping the clutter. Her body still existed, but its movement no longer asked for attention. She sat by a tree, whose bark grew inward instead of out, and rested her cheek against its curved trunk as if it had been grown to hold her. Around her, others rested in silence, though no two chose the same way. One lay stretched along a fallen log, hands resting on his chest as if waiting for a sound that never came. Another knelt, head bowed, not in sorrow but in gratitude, though for what, even she could not say. A third wandered in slow circles, each lap smaller than the last, until he simply stopped moving, not from exhaustion, but because the circle had closed. They did not speak. They did not name one another. In a place where shadows did not stretch, words no longer carried weight. Occasionally, something distant would pass between the trees, a shimmer without shape, or a hush that moved like an invisible ribbon through the underbrush. The ones who saw it did not follow. They only watched, the way one watches a childhood memory slip back into sleep. It was not meant to be understood. It was enough that it existed. The forest offered no lessons, only the silence in which one could ask questions without needing to hear the answer. Above, the light dimmed into something like dusk, though no sun marked its descent. The color of the air shifted, muted blues melting into silver, then into a faint, powdery gray. In that softened hour, the forest felt like a breath being held, not out of fear, but reverence. The hush grew deeper. Even the space between thoughts stretched longer. Some closed their eyes. Others did not need to. The moment passed without conclusion, and the ones who remained did so as part of it. Not separate, not defined, just present, like mist that chooses not to lift. As the forest stretched outward, it did not thin. It became more spacious, as though it was giving those who remained a wider berth, a gentler horizon within which to dissolve. This openness was not emptiness. It was trust. There were no barriers, no gates, just a subtle expansion, like the way sleep spreads through limbs after a long day. Those who entered did not hurry. They found themselves walking without need for arrival. There was no destination, and so there was no rush. The ground beneath them welcomed each step with silence, then smoothed the print behind it. The forest did not collect footprints. It remembered motion, not evidence. Some among them began to lose the sensation of weight, not in their bodies, which remained, but in their presence. Their movements grew softer, less defined. They no longer startled birds, though there were none. They no longer stirred dust, though the earth remained dry. They began to pass through the forest like slow-moving thought, trailing no consequence behind. In one glade, a man lifted his arm and held it in the light, but saw only faint shimmer where his outline once had cast certainty. He smiled, not in pride, but in release. It was the first time he had felt truly unburdened. Plants here did not grow toward the sun. They grew toward silence. Petals opened without seeking light, as if fed by stillness itself. Vines curled not up but inward, weaving into spirals that never ended. Moss blanketed not rocks, but absence. It grew thickest where something once had been and no longer was. A stone, perhaps, or a sleeping figure, or a forgotten name. The moss covered and forgave, not erasing but easing. Around it the air held a scent of things that had passed gently. Wood turned soft with age, wind after rain, paper that had been written on long ago. Some lay down and did not rise, not because they could not, but because they no longer needed to. Their bodies rested with the forest, not separate from it. And in their stillness, the land changed very slightly. Leaves leaned closer, light bent slower, and a hush deepened in that particular spot, like a breath drawn and never released. Those who passed by understood. They did not grieve. The person was not lost. They had merely settled more deeply into the place they had always belonged. A quiet formed, different from all other silences before. It was not absence, nor waiting. It was completeness. Nothing more needed to be added. Nothing more asked to be explained. In that silence, the forest seemed to say, "This is what remains when all stories have ended, and yet something still breathes," without needing a name. Beyond the edge of this widening space, the forest began to blur, not visually, but ontologically. Its reality softened, as though the fabric of being there became optional. Shapes still existed, but their outlines shimmered with uncertainty. A tree might appear taller one moment, then fold slightly into itself the next. A stream, previously unnoticed, flowed without sound or direction, then stilled mid-movement like a thought reconsidered. Those who had remained long enough did not question these changes. They had stopped needing consistency. In a place where identity had become fluid, why should the land be any more rigid? Here, people began to forget movement altogether, not because they were paralyzed, but because they had ceased to differentiate between motion and stillness. A woman stood for so long beneath a tree that vines began to grow near her feet. She was not trapped. She simply had no reason to leave. Her eyes remained open, but what she saw could no longer be put into words, not because it was too complex, but because language no longer wrapped around the shape of her experience. It was like trying to name a breeze. Even sound, rare as it was, began to dissolve. A branch fell once, dry and brittle, but struck the ground without noise. A group of figures stood nearby and turned slightly, not in surprise but in acknowledgement. They felt the impact, though it made no sound. It was as if sound had agreed to no longer interrupt. There was no longer need for declaration. Presence itself was enough. Some among them began to lose even form. They were still visible, but only barely. Like shadows behind frosted glass, they moved not with steps, but with permission. The forest did not ask for them to become this way. It only allowed it, as it had always done. They were not becoming trees. They were becoming less separate from everything else. Their outlines pulsed slowly, like something remembered but not fixed. A man, once a traveler, stood with arms at his sides. He closed his eyes and exhaled, not with exhaustion, but with conclusion. His form flickered gently, then held. Around him, the air thickened into calm. He was not dead. He had not disappeared. He had simply returned. Returned not to a place, but to a state that had no beginning. The forest received him the way dusk receives light, slowly, respectfully, without urgency. This was the forest's final language, not sound, not sight, but the hush that arrives when separation ends. It was not an end. It was not a beginning. It was simply where difference fell asleep. There was a clearing, deeper than most dared to reach, that did not announce itself. It was not wider or brighter. It had no center. It merely existed in a space where the forest forgot to stand. Those who arrived there did so without intention. They stepped through a veil of branches, or perhaps through the memory of one, and found themselves surrounded by air so still it felt carved. No leaves moved. No insects stirred. Even the light, if it could be called that, held its place like dust in a closed room. In this clearing, time refused to pass. Not slowly, not quickly, just not at all. A footstep made no difference. A breath neither began nor ended. Some sat and felt their own pulse fade, not in fear, but in awe. They had never noticed how loud living was until it stopped echoing. The silence here was not emptiness. It was density, a fullness so complete that nothing more could enter without overflowing. Those who lingered too long found themselves dissolving, not into death, but into stillness. Their bodies remained, but the part of them that needed beginning and end did not. One figure, a boy or man, it no longer mattered, lay on his side, eyes open, gazing at nothing. Around him, small white flowers had grown in perfect silence, forming a ring that did not break. No seeds had been scattered. No gardener had planted them. They simply responded to his presence. The petals never withered. The ring remained, seasonless, timeless. Others walked past, slowing as they approached, then quickening their pace, not because they feared what they saw, but because it was complete. Some things asked to be left undisturbed. The air in the clearing held scentless weight, like the moment between question and answer. It pressed gently on the skin, not as wind, but as memory. Those who breathed it in forgot how long they had been walking, how long they had been thinking. They remembered only a feeling of letting go, of becoming unbound from the self that required shape. It was here that many stopped casting shadows entirely. Their outlines held, but the forest no longer insisted on recording them. Light passed through without judgment. The ground did not respond. Nothing marked the edge of the clearing. You simply knew when you were no longer in it. As you stepped beyond it, your thoughts returned. Slowly, cautiously. Time restarted, gently ticking somewhere in the distance, like the faintest tapping on glass. The body remembered how to weigh itself again. The heart beat a little louder. But those who had stood within never forgot the sensation. Even after leaving, something inside them had thinned, like fog made flesh. They were not ghosts. They were no longer only people. Beyond the clearing, the forest began to take on the qualities of water, not wetness but fluidity. Shapes rippled when not directly observed. Colors shifted by memory alone. A tree once seen as gray now shimmered with green, then silver, then disappeared when forgotten. People walked here not in lines, but in intentions. Some moved with a thought and found themselves somewhere new. Others closed their eyes and arrived where they had never meant to go. It was not magic. It was permission. The forest had stopped asking for explanation, and those within had stopped offering it. Some began to realize they had not spoken in days, perhaps longer. Their mouths still moved from time to time, but no sound emerged. And there was no need. Communication had become something thinner, finer, like threads drawn between awarenesses. You knew when someone near you understood you. You knew when they didn't. No misunderstanding lingered. Even disagreement fell away. Not from resolution, but from irrelevance. In a place where nothing was claimed, there was nothing to defend. A man who had carried grief for 30 years placed a hand against the bark of a tree that had no rings. The grief did not vanish. It flowed downward, through his arm, into the tree, and then nowhere. It did not echo. It was not absorbed. It simply stopped needing to be held. He sat down, not relieved, but lightened. He did not feel joy, nor sorrow, only absence. The kind that remains after a fever breaks, or after a long-held breath is let go. The forest had not healed him. It had let him become unnecessary to his own suffering. Others who passed nearby did not look at him, but they sensed him. His presence had changed shape. He had become something closer to quiet. When he stood, his feet left no mark, not because the ground was soft, but because he no longer pressed against it. His movements resembled wind in tall grass, visible only in suggestion. He joined no group. He moved with no purpose. And yet, he was not lost, only directionless in the way clouds are, shifting because the sky permits them. At the edge of this watery space, the forest narrowed, not physically but perceptually. Some saw it as a narrowing hallway, others felt it as the final breath before sleep, and a few never reached it at all. They paused, turned, or vanished, not as disappearance but as fulfillment. The ones who reached it often smiled without realizing. Their forms grew translucent, their weight lifted, and then, without ceremony, they stepped through the final space of the forest, not out, but in, deeper into whatever came next. And behind them, the forest closed gently, not to keep others out, but to remind those still within that some journeys end not in returning, but in soft and sacred forgetting. There was a path, though none remembered creating it. It did not wind or curve, nor did it stretch in any clear direction. It simply existed, like breath between moments, or a line drawn in still water. Those who followed it did not do so because they sought an end, but because it felt familiar, as if their bodies already knew the rhythm of its terrain. The ground here was neither soil nor stone. It gave slightly underfoot, like the memory of moss. No prints stayed, no dust rose. Movement was acknowledged, then forgotten, an act of grace, not indifference. Along this path, trees stood farther apart, their branches higher, their roots wide like open arms. The air carried a scent no one could name, a blend of old parchment, faded linen, and something green that had never been picked. It was not fragrant, it was not sweet. It simply confirmed presence, as if the forest itself were reminding them, you are still here, even if what you are is less certain now. They breathed it in not for comfort, but to feel that breathing still happened, even if only as an echo. Every few steps, something shifted, not visibly, but in sensation. A warmth behind the neck, a hush around the knees, a pulse beneath the soles. It was as if the forest wrapped its perception around those walking, like adjusting a shawl on someone dozing in a chair. This care was not personal. It did not stem from affection. It came from the understanding that even those unraveling deserved to do so gently. Nothing in the forest hurried their unraveling. It simply allowed threads to loosen, one after another, until each person resembled not a figure in motion but the suggestion of one. To the left of the path there stood a tree whose bark rippled slightly, even when the wind did not blow. Its trunk bore no rings, its branches held no leaves, yet it hummed, not aloud, but in vibration. Those who passed it often paused. Some reached out but never touched. Others knelt as though in the presence of something vast yet familiar. It was not worship, it was recollection. This tree, unlike others, felt as though it had once been something else. Not a person, not an object, but a decision, long ago, made and never undone. It had settled here, and grown quiet with time. Further ahead, the path crossed over itself, or appeared to. A loop of ground that mirrored itself perfectly, down to each pebble and curl of fallen leaf. No matter where one turned, they ended up facing the same direction again. Some turned back. Others kept walking. A few stood in the center, motionless, allowing the repetition to wash over them like tide. It was not disorienting. It was instructional. Here was a space that said, "You are not meant to proceed. You are meant to remain, and understand that remaining is also a kind of movement." And in that moment, for those who stayed, something within them softened further. The tension between past and future eased. The need to define where they were going dissolved. The forest, with its subtle spirals and silences, had no need for destinations. It offered only thresholds, quiet thresholds where the self could step forward, not into a new place, but into a deeper form of stillness that resembled acceptance more than arrival. To the right of the looping path, there existed a small ridge, a rise in the land so gentle it could be mistaken for a fold in the fabric of thought. From its crest, if one could call it that, the view was not expansive. It revealed no horizon, no landmark, no end. Yet those who climbed it found something else, a sense of elevation not of the body, but of perception. Standing there, they did not feel taller. They felt thinner, as if the self had stretched upward slightly, lifting from the bones like steam from warm stone. It was not an escape. It was a drifting. Below the ridge, a stream that made no sound traced the base of the trees in a looping curve. The water moved, though it gave no indication of origin or destination. It did not reflect the sky. It did not hold stones or fish or fallen leaves. It held only the shimmer of memory, scenes that flickered just below its surface, vanishing the moment one tried to name them. A father's hand, a candle in a window, the curl of a beloved's hair as they turned away. Not full memories, just fragments, echoes, the kind that rise in dreams and leave behind nothing but warmth or ache. Some sat by this stream for hours, unmoving. They stared into the water, not to remember, but to forget more cleanly. The forest did not punish remembrance, but it offered something quieter, a place where remembering was no longer required for something to matter, a place where grief did not need to be carried like a badge to prove love had once existed. Here, the stream whispered, not with words, but with stillness. It is enough that you came this far. The ridge curved gently into a hollow, shaded by trees whose branches never touched. Between them, slivers of light formed shifting shapes, shapes that resembled nothing in particular, yet stirred a recognition too deep to be described. A hand brushing fabric, the turn of a key, the moment before someone speaks. These shapes moved like thoughts that had not yet become language. Some reached toward them, others let them pass. They were not illusions. They were what remains when silence becomes generous. As evening approached, or what resembled it, the light turned the color of parchment soaked in tea. The air grew cooler, not in temperature, but in tone. Sounds, already rare, withdrew further, until even breath felt too loud. Those who remained near the ridge became less concerned with direction. Some walked in slow figure eights. Others paced in patterns only they understood. The forest did not mind. It had long ago ceased to require logic from those within it. And then there were those who simply lay down, not from weariness, but because there was nothing left to do but be still. They did not sleep. They did not speak. Their presence melted into the ridge itself, like ink soaking into cloth. The ground, in turn, welcomed them with a hush, covering them not in soil, but in forgetfulness. Soft, slow, complete. There was a fog that did not move. It hovered just above the ground in one portion of the forest, low and silver and endlessly still. It did not rise in the morning or lift in the sun, neither of which held dominion here. Instead, it simply remained, like a breath held between two centuries, Those who walked into it felt nothing upon entry. The air did not change. Their skin did not chill. But soon, the fog seeped inward, not around them, but into them. Their thoughts slowed, not from fear, but from surrender. They were not forgetting. They were becoming less dependent on remembering. Inside the fog, sight shortened to mere steps. The trees around became impressions, tall suggestions of vertical stillness, stretching forever upward into white. Shadows, already rare, vanished entirely. One might look down and see only their feet, then blink and see only ground. Their hands, raised before their face, became outlines, then hints, then memory. It was not disorienting. It was gentle. A soft invitation to trust space without needing to define it. One figure stood still in the fog for a long while. Time passed, if it passed at all, without event. They did not move. They did not need to. Around them, the air hummed, not as sound, but as presence. It pressed gently against the ribs, reminding them they still existed, even if their outline did not prove it. They placed a hand on their chest, feeling no heartbeat, but knowing they remained. That knowledge was not factual. It was intuitive, like knowing the rain before the first drop falls. Sometimes, small objects appeared in the fog. A ribbon, a stone, perfectly round, a feather with no bird. These were not offerings. They were reminders of softness, of curve, of stillness. Some bent down to pick them up, others walked past without noticing. The fog did not explain. It simply allowed what was light to remain visible, and what was heavy to dissolve. Thoughts weighed differently here. A regret might vanish in minutes. A kindness might last forever. The fog did not judge. It preserved only what chose to stay. A clearing within the fog, if it could be called that, contained nothing. No tree, no stone, just space. Those who found it often stayed, sometimes kneeling, sometimes lying flat, faces toward the unseen sky. They listened, not for sound, but for the moment when even listening became unnecessary. Some swore they heard something. The first sound after creation. The last sound before it all goes quiet. Most did not. Most simply exhaled, and in that breath, became part of the hush. Those who left the fog found their outlines again, though dimmer. Their steps left less mark. Their breath stirred fewer leaves. They were not lighter. They were less separate. The fog had not changed them. It had remembered them more clearly than they had ever dared to remember themselves. Deep within the forest, there stood a wall, not built, but grown. It rose not from stone or wood, but from the accumulation of time. It resembled a cliff in form, though closer inspection revealed it to be woven from roots, dust, and silence. Its surface was uneven, marked by ridges that resembled fingerprints, though none were human. The wall did not block passage. It invited pause, and those who reached it did just that. They stopped, not in confusion or fear, but because something in them recognized it as a mirror too large to see all at once. No one climbed it. No one walked along it. They sat before it. Some wept, not from sadness, but from the realization that they had nothing left to say. Others reached out, fingers brushing the surface, and felt only warmth. Not heat, but the warmth of being noticed. A man sat before the wall and placed his palms on his knees, eyes open, mouth closed. Around him, the air thickened slightly, not with tension, but with awareness. He had carried questions for years. They did not get answered. They simply stopped asking. The wall shimmered in places, like water beneath parchment. Images flickered across it. Faces, hands, doors closing, footsteps receding. But only briefly, and only if one did not try to see. The moment attention was focused, the wall became blank again. It was not a screen. It was not an oracle. It was a surface upon which the forest reflected what the person had almost forgotten to forget. Not as punishment, not as memory, as recognition. Sometimes, the wall whispered, not audibly, but within the skin. A vibration in the ribs, a hush behind the ears. It did not speak in words, but in phrases the bones remembered. Let go. You have done enough. There is nothing to carry now. These were not commands. They were permissions. And for some, that was all they had been waiting for. At night, or something like night, the wall glowed faintly, a pulse of light, like the fading of a candle through cloth. Those who remained nearby felt no fear. The glow was not warning, it was breath. The wall breathed, slowly, with them, and in that rhythm they fell asleep without closing their eyes. Dreams came, but not as stories, as sensations, as rest made visible. And when they woke, if waking applied here, they stood not to leave but to walk beside the wall, not following it, not tracing it, just accompanying it. It did not end. It curved softly into the forest, disappearing the same way breath disappears after being released. Felt, then forgotten. There was a field at the edge of forgetting. It did not bloom. It did not wither. It simply held space, wide, unbroken, brushed only by the slow movement of air that remembered how to breathe without rushing. Grass there did not grow tall. It lay close to the earth, soft and undisturbed, as if it knew its role was not to be seen, but to be felt. Those who arrived at the field often paused just before stepping onto it, not because they were afraid, but because they sensed something delicate beneath each blade, something that had been waiting to be walked upon gently. No paths crossed this field. No stones marked direction. But every step forward brought a deepening of quiet, a kind of internal dimming that did not feel like loss, but like sleep approaching behind the eyes. The wind, if it could be called that, hummed without sound. It moved in long sighs, touching cheekbones, wrists, the backs of knees. One might stand there for hours and never notice the passage of time, not because time stopped, but because it no longer insisted on being acknowledged. Far out in the center, a single post stood, wooden, pale, unmarked. It leaned slightly to one side, as if in conversation with gravity. No message was nailed to it, no cloth wrapped around it. Yet everyone who saw it felt as though it had spoken. Not loudly, not urgently, but with the softness of a voice you hear only after the room falls quiet. It did not ask them to come closer, yet many did. They circled it without reason. Some sat beside it, some reached toward it, but none touched. The post did not demand reverence, it simply existed without apology. Around the post, the field held stories, not written, not spoken, but remembered by the land itself. Footprints from those who no longer walked, sense of moments never captured. The weight of silence once shared between two people who no longer needed to speak. These things did not haunt. They hovered, like echoes of warmth on a pillow long after someone has risen. The field did not collect these remnants. It hosted them, gently, like a room always ready to be filled, but never insisting it must be. Some who reached this field did not continue. They lay down among the short grass and stared upward, though the sky showed nothing but a soft, endless gray. Their breath slowed until it matched the hush around them. Their thoughts quieted until they resembled the color of dusk. They did not vanish. They did not transform. They became part of the field's memory, held, not kept, felt, not bound. When others passed through later, they would sometimes pause in a particular spot, sensing something, someone just beyond the edge of sound. And they would smile, without knowing why. Beyond the field, where the forest thickened once more, there was a path made entirely of light. It did not glow. It did not shine. It was simply brighter than the ground beside it, subtly, softly, like a road that had been walked by hope itself. The path did not appear from above. It appeared from within. When one looked directly at it, it disappeared. But when one allowed their eyes to relax, to blur slightly, it returned, faint, familiar, like the outline of a dream that had visited many times, but never stayed. This path did not lead to a destination. It led through sensation. Every step forward felt like stepping into the memory of something kind. A hand on a shoulder, a song heard through a half-closed door, the silence between waves. Those who followed it often wept, but not from sadness. Their tears came without explanation, without climax, as if their bodies had stored water for years, waiting for a place gentle enough to let it flow freely. The forest, in return, caught each tear without sound, without ceremony. It gave the water back to the soil, and from it a softness grew. The light path was narrow, yet no one crowded. They took turns without speaking. Some walked for hours, others only a few steps. It was not the distance that mattered, but the readiness to feel what the forest had remembered on their behalf. A woman walked this path with her hands cupped in front of her, though they held nothing. Each step deepened the stillness inside her, until the absence between her fingers felt full. She did not need to know what it was. The not knowing was enough. At the end of the path, if such a word could be used, there stood a doorway with no frame, a simple shape in the air where the trees parted perfectly, forming not an exit but a threshold. Beyond it, there was only mist, or light, or the inside of a breath not yet released. No one rushed through it. Those who reached it often stood beside it, shoulder brushing its invisible frame, as if waiting for an invitation that could only be whispered by the part of them that no longer needed names. Some passed through, others did not. Those who did were never seen again, but not because they were lost. They simply ceased to require observation. The forest did not record them. The light did not hold them. They became part of the stillness that allowed the forest to exist in the first place, a stillness older than memory, deeper than time, and softer than any shadow could ever be. And for those who stayed behind, the doorway remained, not open or closed, not asking or denying. It existed only as long as it was needed, and then, like everything else in the forest, it gently forgot to remain. There was a bend in the forest where the trees began to lean, not in collapse, but in choreography. Each trunk tilted slightly toward the center of an invisible spiral, as if drawn to something unspoken. From above, if any eye could see from that height, the pattern would reveal itself, a great slow curve, spiraling inward, formed not by path nor by clearing, but by the gentle posture of trees that had long agreed to turn their backs on straightness. This was not nature disrupted. It was intention revealed in silence. Those who entered this bend felt it before they understood it. Their steps curved without decision, their thoughts arced inward. Even their breath seemed to round at the edges, becoming softer, fuller, as if reshaped by the air itself. Time, once loosened in earlier parts of the forest, here folded gently inward, like paper turned in on itself. The past did not vanish. The future did not retreat. They simply aligned, side by side, like two hands resting quietly in the lap of stillness. Near the heart of the spiral, the ground was covered in fallen leaves that never rotted. They remained crisp, but pale, as if bleached by memory. No wind disturbed them, no foot crushed them. They arranged themselves in natural symmetry, forming rings around nothing, perfect circles with no center. When someone stepped too close, the leaves did not scatter. They reformed behind each step, closing again, preserving the emptiness. The forest did not resist intrusion. It merely absorbed the disruption and forgot it happened. Some sat among the trees, aligning their spines with the curve of the trunks, mimicking the lean, not by command, but by instinct. Their bodies relaxed into the shape of the spiral, not for comfort, but for resonance. There was a rhythm in this place, not musical, not audible, but somatic. A deep pulsing known only to the bones. It called not to the ears, but to the marrow. Those who listened did not move. They let their breath synchronize, and in doing so found a kind of stillness that pulsed with the quiet confidence of something eternal. The light here behaved differently. It bent with the trees, filtered not in beams but in swirls. At certain hours, or what passed for hours, a kind of glow hovered mid-air, like dust suspended in amber. One could wave a hand through it and find nothing, yet feel as though they had brushed against thought itself. A man stood still for so long in that glow that moss began to grow on his boots. He did not mind. He had forgotten they were his. He simply stood, watching the way the light curved in and out of itself like breath never exhaled. And at the center of the spiral, where no one could reach, not because they were not allowed, but because a rival had ceased to matter, there was an opening in the canopy. Not large, not dramatic, just enough to remind the earth below that sky still existed. Through this hole no stars could be seen, no sun, only a gentle nothingness, soft and pale, like the inside of a closed eye. And under that eye, the forest slept, curled inward like a thought that no longer needed words. There was a hush in the spiral that extended beyond silence. It was a stillness of consequence. Each moment held the weight of presence without the need for expression. The ones who sat there did not speak. They barely breathed. They were not meditating. They were not escaping. They were simply remembering how it felt to be without the noise of becoming. The spiral had a way of turning the body inward, not physically, but in attention. The external softened. The internal uncoiled. Thoughts became simpler, like ripples spreading from a stone that had already sunk. One figure sat at the edge of a ring of leaves and began to trace circles in the soil. Not large, not deep, just gentle grooves with a fingertip, slow and repeating. They did not look at their hand. They did not know why they did it. The motion became a rhythm, then a ritual, then a language no one taught. Another figure, seated across from them, mirrored the movement unconsciously, though neither noticed the other. They were not copying. They were resonating. Somewhere in the space between their gestures, the spiral deepened. Animals rarely entered this part of the forest, yet now and then a moth might flutter through the light, its wings barely visible except when they caught the shimmer. These moths were not drawn to flame or sound. They seemed to drift on memory itself, wings carried by longing. One landed on a shoulder and remained, unmoving. When the figure stood, it did not fly away. It simply folded into the shape of the shirt, like thread returning to cloth. Here, even the living learned how to hold stillness with grace. The trees in the spiral dropped no leaves. Their bark did not flake. Yet on the ground, leaves multiplied. No one saw them fall, but they accumulated, always in circles, always in patterns that spoke of something just beyond understanding. Some tried to count them, others closed their eyes and listened instead. The forest rewarded neither approach. It offered no symbols, only suggestions. No answers, only alignment. Even time circled. Some claimed they had returned to moments from childhood, not as memories, but as sensations. A breeze that smelled like soap. A shadow that resembled a loved one standing in a doorway. The forest did not conjure ghosts. It simply allowed the forgotten to rest nearby. Not haunting, not beckoning. Just existing quietly like folded clothes that still carry warmth. And when the spiral began to dissolve, not in shape, but in urgency, those who remained felt no disappointment. The trees did not straighten. The path did not vanish. But something inside them knew. They had turned far enough inward. They could stand now, not as they were, but as who they had never needed to define. Not healed, not broken. Simply returned. Past the spiral lay a slope that descended so gently it was almost unnoticeable. One might walk for hours without realizing they were going downward. The air became cooler, though never cold. The light dimmed, though never dark. There was no sense of descent in the traditional sense. Only a soft pull, like being drawn into memory that was not yours. Those who entered this slope often found themselves breathing more slowly, as if their lungs understood the change before their minds did. On either side of the slope, stones rose from the ground, not placed, not carved, but grown. They were tall and narrow, spaced irregularly, each bearing a surface that shimmered slightly when passed. Some believed they were markers, others believed they were watchers, but the truth lay in their refusal to demand anything. They stood patient and permanent, like questions that had long ago stopped needing answers. Occasionally, a person would stop beside one and lean gently against it. The stone never moved, but it always seemed to receive. As the path continued, the ground began to hum, not with sound, but with memory. Beneath each footstep, a vibration stirred, like distant thunder heard not through ears, but through bones. It was not ominous. It was not warning. It was grounding. A reminder that the forest was not just above and around, but beneath as well. Those who walked here found themselves thinking less in words and more in shapes. Emotions formed as curves. Questions became circles. Regret softened into ellipses. A narrow stream cut across the slope, no wider than a handspan. Its surface did not ripple, even when touched. Some knelt beside it and cupped water into their hands, but the water slipped through before reaching the lips. It was not meant to be consumed. It was meant to be held, briefly, like memory, like grief, like light on the skin. One figure dipped their hand into the stream and then placed that hand over their heart. They stood that way for a long time, unmoving, until the stream itself changed course ever so slightly, bending toward them. Birds did not sing here, but feathers drifted down from time to time, pale, delicate, never landing. They hovered inches from the earth, suspended in stillness. No wind held them. No branch had lost them. They existed between falling and floating, like decisions not yet made. Children in the forest sometimes reached out to catch one, but their hands passed through as if the feathers were dreams refusing to be held. And when the slope leveled, it did not lead anywhere. It simply stopped being a slope. Those who noticed smiled. Those who didn't continued walking. Either way, the forest had offered them a place where direction no longer defined meaning, where movement itself became meditation, and that was enough. That, at the base of the slope, the forest began to widen again. Not in distance, but in permission. The trees grew further apart, as if allowing space for reflection. Here, the ground was covered in soft moss that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. Not bright enough to illuminate, but enough to reassure. Each step left no mark. Each breath was returned more gently than it was taken. This was not a place of revelation. It was a place of return. Some came here to sit beneath the tallest tree, a pillar of silence with bark smooth as weathered stone, its roots twisted in patterns that resembled ancient writing, glyphs with no translation, but deep familiarity. One person traced the shapes with their fingers and began to hum without realizing. Not a tune, not a song, just a vibration that echoed softly in the chest. The tree did not react, but the air around it thickened slightly, as if recognizing the effort of expression without requiring it to be complete. The space held old warmth, like rooms where laughter once lived, not loud, not recent, but present in the walls. A bench made of stone rested near a hollow where something might once have been buried, though no sign remained. A figure sat on the bench and closed their eyes. They did not think. They did not sleep. They simply aligned with the stillness that rose from the moss and settled into the shoulders like memory that no longer hurt. A shallow pond glistened at the far end of the clearing. It reflected nothing, not because it was dark, but because it had chosen not to mirror. One could stare into it for hours and see only the absence of reflection, which in itself became a kind of honesty. A child once tossed a stone into it and watched the ripples remain for an impossibly long time. The circles spread outward, touched the edge of the pond, then folded back in, returning to where they began. The stone never sank. It rested just beneath the surface, forever paused. The clearing did not ask anything of those who entered. It offered no instruction. It held only space, the rarest gift of all. Some stayed for a night, others for years. It did not matter. The forest marked neither. Time here was not counted but held. And when someone stood to leave, the moss beneath their feet rose back into place, as if their absence too was part of the design. And above all this, the canopy thinned into a veil, letting in just enough sky to remember light, but not enough to be distracted by it. This was a space between, not arrival, not departure, a moment suspended, a breath not held, but shared. There was a portion of the forest where sound returned, Not abruptly, not loudly, but gently, like a forgotten friend knocking at the edge of a dream. It began with a rustle that seemed to come from within the chest, rather than from the trees, then the soft trickle of something flowing, not water, not wind, but continuity, a rejoining of parts that had once drifted too far apart. Those who reached this space often paused, startled not by noise, but by its absence ending. It was as if the hush that had cradled them until now had decided they were ready to hear again. Birdsong here was unlike any other. It did not echo. It did not repeat. Each note felt as if it had been sung only once. For one listener, never to be heard again. A sound born of exactness, of place, of time, of breath. One person stood beneath a tree and tilted their head, not to locate the source, but to receive the tone more fully. Their eyes closed. Their lips parted slightly, not to speak, but to feel. The sound moved through them like light filtered through lace, present, precise, and impossibly soft. Elsewhere, a branch cracked under its own age and fell, striking the ground with a sigh. It startled no one. It was acknowledged without reaction, the way one acknowledges a cloud shifting in the sky. Sound here did not demand attention. It participated. It arrived, did its part, and departed without insistence. Even footsteps now whispered back to the walker, not with resistance, but with recognition. Each tread answered by a faint rustle, as if the earth were finally ready to join the conversation again. Near the center of this space stood a low stone wall, only waist-high, partially hidden by vines. It did not enclose anything. It simply traced a half circle, like the memory of protection. People leaned against it. Some traced its surface with their palms. A few sat on it, legs dangling, listening to the way their own silence changed as they settled. It was not music they heard. It was alignment. The gentle realization that stillness and sound were not enemies, only lovers who had spent time apart. Wind here made no dramatic entrances. It stirred only when asked, and even then, answered softly. A few leaves shifted, a bit of dust danced, hair moved gently across the cheek. That was all. Enough to say, the world is still in motion, even when you are not. It was not a reminder. It was an invitation, not to act, but to witness. And when someone sang, not with words, not even with melody, but with tone alone, the forest did not echo it. It absorbed it. And then, a few heartbeats later, returned a different note, not as answer, as embrace. Beyond the space where sound returned, the forest took on the shape of endings, not finality, but resolution. The trees grew taller again, though spaced wider, their canopies forming a cathedral of green and gold. Light filtered through as if remembering how to fall gently. The ground was firmer here, covered in fine pine needles and patches of earth so dark they seemed to drink shadow. Those who reached this place did not hurry. Their steps became deliberate, ceremonial. Not because they followed a rite, but because their bodies understood the gravity of quiet completion. Here, the air was filled with the sense that things had already happened. Not just once, but many times. This was a place layered in repetition, not of actions, but of understandings. One could sit in any corner and feel as though someone had once sat there before. Not a specific person, just presence, folded softly into the landscape like a page turned down at the corner to mark a favorite passage. And in that shared stillness, time lost all pretense of being linear. There was a large stone at the center, shaped not by chisel but by patience. It had no carvings, no inscription, yet every person who saw it paused. Some sat with their backs against it. Others pressed a palm to its surface. It was not warm. It was not cold. It simply remembered everything. Not in detail, not in image, but in depth. It held the weight of unspoken things. Regrets forgiven. Questions released. Longing that had softened into peace. No one wept here. Not because sorrow had vanished, but because it had found a place to rest. The forest beyond this point grew thinner, not barren, just lighter, like the final pages of a story where words are fewer. but meaning deepens. Birds passed through more often now, wings quiet against the air. Squirrels darted from branch to branch, their movements easy, unhurried. Even the smallest creatures understood that this space was not one of tension, but of rest. The hush here was not emptiness, it was earned. Some chose to stay. They made no camps, built no shelters. They simply lived among the trees as breath lives within the lungs, unnoticed until exhaled. Others moved onward, though they did not know toward what. There was no sign, no ending, just a widening of space, a lifting of weight, and a growing awareness that the forest no longer needed to hold them. They had learned what stillness could offer. They had tasted quiet enough to carry it elsewhere. And as they stepped forward, they did not vanish. They did not ascend. They continued gently into whatever came next, not as seekers, not as wanderers, but as those who now understood that even silence has a shape. And it is not empty. It is sacred. There came a moment in the forest when one no longer asked where they were, not because the answer had been found, but because the question had fallen away. The path, if it could still be called that, now resembled a thought remembered from long ago, soft-edged, incomplete, but undeniably yours. It wound through a grove where the trees had thinned to a respectful distance, each one standing like a gentle witness. They no longer leaned. They no longer watched. They simply stood, quiet, old, and at peace with your passing. Here the forest was lighter, not in color, but in weight. Each step stirred nothing. The ground accepted the foot not as impact, but as continuation. A bird passed overhead without calling. A branch creaked in the breeze, then stilled. And when the breeze itself subsided, it did not return. It had completed its task. Those who walked through this place often carried their arms loosely at their sides, fingers uncurled. Their bodies no longer held tension, because nothing was expected of them anymore. Not from the world, not from themselves. At the base of a small hill, moss grew in perfect lines, not planted, not directed, but settled there by shared agreement between time and stillness. The lines curved gently, like writing in a language that had never been spoken aloud. A figure knelt there, not in reverence but in rhythm, and began to trace one line with a fingertip. It was not an act of understanding, it was an act of participation. They followed the curve, slowly, until their hand stopped on its own, not at the end, but at a place that felt complete. The moss, untouched, shimmered slightly and held its form. Others wandered among the trees, not as individuals, but as presence. There was no need for names here, no memory of identity as separation. One could look upon another and feel only recognition, not of who, but of what had been carried and now gently set down. There were no stories told aloud, yet every silence shared became a kind of story, one that did not require language to be believed. The forest did not listen. It joined. Farther along, a wooden arch stood without purpose. It bore no gate, no fence, no hinges. It simply marked a space where something had once changed and now changed again. Those who passed beneath it felt a lightness in the soles of their feet, not an ascent, but an easing. The sense that the ground itself now rose to meet them, rather than wait for them to press it down. One woman paused beneath the arch and exhaled so slowly that the breath seemed to return to her, softer, like mist curling back toward water. There were no shadows here, not because the light had vanished, but because it had been accepted so fully that there was nothing left to resist it. In this space, light did not fall. It rested. It hovered in the air like warmth from a long-forgotten blanket, or the echo of a voice that once called your name, not to summon you, but to remind you that you were never alone. And in that reminder, the journey continued, not forward, not backward, but deeper into the quiet that knew your name before you had one. Beyond the wooden arch, the forest opened into a space shaped not by geography, but by feeling. There were no borders, no shifts in vegetation, no signs that one had entered a new place. Yet something in the breath changed. Inhalation came deeper. Exhalation lengthened. Even the pause between the two seemed to stretch, filled with something unspoken. It was here that people began to move more slowly, not out of caution, but because the air itself seemed to ask for softness, as though every motion, every blink might disturb a layer of reality laid thin and sacred across the ground. Small stones dotted the clearing, each no larger than a fist. They formed no pattern, yet they felt arranged. People walked among them, stepping with instinct rather than plan. Some stopped and sat on one. Others gently moved a stone an inch to the left or right, not to correct, but to contribute. The stones did not resist. They bore no moss, no inscription, but each one carried presence, like placeholders for thoughts too quiet to become words. Together, they formed a kind of music, though no sound played. It was music one felt in the palms and feet. A stream, barely more than a thread, ran through the space. It moved only when looked at. Otherwise, it rested. Those who knelt beside it found not water, but reflection, not of themselves, but of their gentlest memory. Not the proudest, not the happiest, just the one that still arrived in dreams unannounced. A father's silhouette on a porch, a dog's breath warming a child's hand, a window open to let in spring. These were not visions. They were recognitions, like the shape your own body makes when sighing. One person placed their hand into the stream and left it there, not to feel wetness, but to feel time. The stream responded not with current, but with calm. The water did not push, it received, and in that receiving something shifted, not in the stream, but in the hand. The fingers loosened, the wrist softened. And slowly, the person withdrew their hand, not empty, but lighter. Above, clouds passed without changing shape. They moved slowly, not across the sky, but across thought. Some people lay on their backs, watching them without watching. The sky did not impress. It allowed. And in its allowance, people remembered how to rest with their eyes open. There was no need to sleep here. The body did not tire. But some chose to close their eyes, not to escape, but to remain more fully. In darkness, they felt held. In stillness, they remembered something older than memory, a truth not spoken, not taught, but inherited from the hush itself. And in that inheritance, they knew. This space was not the end of the forest. It was the beginning of forgetting how to leave. Not far from the stream, nestled beneath a grove of trees whose trunks grew in slow spirals, there lay a space where gravity seemed to hush. Steps became lighter, as if the forest no longer required your full weight. Arms swung more freely. Shoulders dropped. It was not relief from burden, but permission to exist without apology. The forest here did not hold you. It honored you. And those who entered found themselves standing taller, not from pride, but from the absence of pressure pressing downward. In this spiral grove, bark bore soft ridges like fingerprints of wind. Leaves moved in slow choreography, even when the air was still. One could stand at the center and feel the trees turning, not physically, but in memory. They remembered every person who had stood there before, and every person yet to come. And in that remembering, they made space for you. You felt it in the back of the neck, in the base of the spine, in the parts of your breath you usually ignore. A circle of stones sat partially embedded in the soil, imperfect, unpolished, each one bearing a crack or a corner worn smooth. Some were large enough to sit upon, others were small enough to hold. Those who touched them felt not energy, but patience. The kind of patience that does not ask, only receives. One person sat among them and placed their hand on 3 stones at once. Their breath slowed. Their heart beat once, then again, then seemed to pause. Not from danger, but from peace. It was in this grove that people began to remember things they never knew they forgot. Not events, not names, but textures. The way certain kinds of silence felt under the ribs. The way sadness had once curled around the spine like a second skin. The way laughter sounded in a room with no one left in it. These were not pains. They were details, edges of stories that no longer needed to be carried, but still deserved to be acknowledged. And the forest acknowledged them all. Even shadows, though long gone, seemed to flicker here, not in light, but in feeling. One might turn and feel something trailing behind, not haunting but accompanying, a presence without form, a shape made only of memory. People began to move more slowly again, not because they were uncertain, but because every step now felt like a kind of goodbye. And in the middle of it all, a breeze finally returned, not sharp, not cold, just present. It moved through the spiral grove like a hand smoothing linen. It touched cheekbones. It stirred the moss. It made the leaves sound almost like words, if one was quiet enough to listen without wanting to hear. At the outer edge of the spiral grove, the forest grew quiet again, not in the way of silence, but in the way of readiness. It was here that the trees stood farther apart, their limbs reaching outward like arms once extended for an embrace that had since grown still. Between them, light fell in columns, straight, pale, and soft-edged. These shafts of illumination did not chase away shadow. They welcomed it, folded it into themselves like silk wrapped around ash. This was not a place of contrast. It was a place of merging. Here, people walked without looking down. Their eyes stayed level, not from arrogance, but from trust. The ground would be where it needed to be. Their steps were slow but unwavering. Some walked with hands open, as if ready to receive something invisible. Others carried nothing, but felt as though they held everything they had ever let go of, now returned, but weightless. There were no markings here. No stones, no streams, no carvings on trees. Only air, only space, only light. And yet, everyone who passed through remembered this stretch more clearly than anything else. Perhaps because it held no story, no symbols, only presence. It was the part of the forest that asked nothing and gave only this, the permission to proceed. One person paused in a shaft of light and turned their face upward. Their lips did not part. Their chest did not rise quickly. They simply stood, allowing the brightness to touch them without claim. The light did not name them. It did not demand proof. It only illuminated the skin and hair and silence with equal softness. Others passed by quietly, offering no words, no looks, but something deeper. Shared stillness. There was no loneliness in this place, only solitude, pure and unburdened. The kind that walks beside you without walking behind. The kind that hears your silence and does not ask it to speak. And at the far end, where the trees began to thin into memory, the light curved downward, like a bowing figure. It did not close the way forward. It nodded to it. The forest had nothing left to give, because it had given everything. And in that completeness it allowed the final part of the journey to begin, not as passage, but as return. Beyond the place where the light bowed, the forest dissolved into something that no longer resembled forest. Trees remained, but they stood like suggestions, transparent at the edges, gently wavering as though painted on fabric stirred by a breeze. Their leaves held color, but not pigment. Their bark bore texture, but not resistance. One could pass a hand through the air beside them and feel both presence and absence, like brushing fingers through a memory still warm. This was the final threshold, not a line, but a lessening. Those who reached this place walked differently, not because they tried, but because they had changed. Their movements were no longer deliberate. They simply unfolded. A step did not begin with thought. It began with readiness. Their arms no longer swung. They rested by their sides like draped cloth. No one here needed to signal to another. Their togetherness was ambient. Their solitude was safe. There was no path here, only direction, and even that dissolved with distance. The ground shimmered, not with light, but with meaning. Each step stirred no dust, but a feeling. Peace, mostly. Occasionally, a flicker of sorrow, not the kind that asks for attention, but the kind that arrives quietly to say, I was here too. And the forest, or what remained of it, allowed it to linger, then allowed it to pass. Some who walked here began to lose the distinction between motion and stillness. One woman stopped moving, not because she chose to, but because she realized she already had. Her feet were grounded, but her sense of presence continued forward, like a sound whose echo reaches a place the voice never did. Others walked beyond her, or perhaps through her. They did not look back. There was no longer a back to look toward, only continuation. In one part of this fading space, a cluster of white leaves lay scattered across the ground. They were not fallen. They had never grown. They simply appeared, gathered in silence like thoughts that had decided to rest together. One man knelt beside them, brushed his fingers through their edges. They did not stir. He smiled, not because they meant something, but because they didn't need to. And just before the end, or whatever word one chooses when no ending feels accurate, there stood a shape, not a figure, not a doorway, just a presence, a pause made visible. Those who reached it did not pass through. They passed into. There was no farewell, no conclusion, only a soft unfolding, a deepening of quiet, a widening of rest. What lay beyond was not described, not even by those who had walked the whole forest, who had touched the bark, breathed the hush, watched their shadows dim and dissolve. There were no words brought back, not because it was forbidden, but because it was complete, and what is complete requires no repetition. It is enough. Still, some remained near the edge, not to delay, not to resist, but to observe the last shape of the forest from within. They sat on low mounds of earth that rose naturally, soft and dry, warm from a light that no longer shone. Around them, the forest pulsed in its final rhythm, one not of growth nor retreat, but return. The kind of return that holds neither pride nor shame, only belonging. Birds flew here, only here. They did not sing. They glided above in slow arcs, their wings steady and unhurried, as if tracing the last loops of thought before stillness. Feathers fell occasionally, catching light in ways the forest did not. Some were gathered by those seated, some were left to rest where they landed. All were accepted. A shallow breeze passed through once each day, though no one marked time. It came without origin, always from behind. It lifted strands of hair, turned leaves face up, whispered nothing into ears that no longer needed comfort. It passed, and then it did not return. That was its gift, once. That was enough. One person stood and walked a few paces beyond the others. They did not look back. Their feet stirred nothing. Their form shimmered for a moment, not like disappearing, but like being rewritten. The space they left behind did not mourn them. It received their absence with the same gentleness it had received their presence. The forest, now quieted to its final hush, breathed once more. Not loudly, not deeply, just enough to say, "I remember." And then even that breath settled. Trees became still. The ground cooled slightly, like bedsheets after rising. The last note of presence dissolved into the air, not ended, just completed. And somewhere within what used to be a path, the moss grew softer. The light stayed low, and the hush remained, as if the forest had told its story, and now waited not for response, but for rest.